My name is Quinn, and at 32 years old, I had never been so useful to anyone as I was to my own family for 3,287 days, until the afternoon I carried a black leather folio into my mother's dining room and sat down at a table that had been set for a celebration that had nothing to do with me. The celebration was for my brother's promotion to regional director of something that sounded like banking, but was mostly administrative oversight, and the guest list had 22 names on it, and I was not one of them. The call came 2 days before the party, and my mother's voice was light and practical, the way it always was when she was asking me to do something she would never remember to say. "Thank you for Quinn. I need you to pick up the centerpieces from the florist by 11 and drop them at my house before noon. I'm swamped." I said yes, because I always said yes, and I had been saying yes since I was 11 years old, and someone needed to watch my brother's hockey equipment in the car while my parents had a drink with the coach because they wanted to make a good impression. I sat in the parking lot of that rink for 2 hours and 23 minutes on a January night with my brother's pads smelling like sweat and my fingers cold through my gloves. And when they came back, my mother patted my head and said, "You always understand." And I did not understand. I was 11, and I was cold, and I had missed the first half of a movie I had been looking for. The second time I remember the line being used, I was 16, and my brother had wrecked the family car taking a curve too fast on County Road 7. And my parents had a dinner party that night with my father's new partner, and they could not be seen driving anything less than the new sedan. So my mother handed me the keys to my grandfather's old truck and said, "You can take that to school. It's not pretty, but it runs. Just make sure you park it around back where nobody sees it." And when I asked why I had to drive the truck, when my brother had been the one who crashed the car, she squeezed my shoulder and said, "You always understand." And I understood that understanding meant I did not get to be angry, and I did not get to be angry, and I did not get to be seen, and I did not get to be seen. Visual: a 19-year-old hand writing numbers in a spiral notebook by lamplight. The hidden ledger started when I was 19 years old, and my parents bought their first vacation property in the mountains. It was a cabin, 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, and a deck that overlooked a valley that filled with fog every morning, like a bowl of milk, and my father told everyone that it was his retirement plan, his investment, his foresight, and I sat at the kitchen table in our house while he explained the financing to my mother, and the equity will be there when we need it. He did not mention my name when he talked about the financing, and he did not mention that I had been working 2 jobs since I was 17 to pay for my own tuition and my own books and my own insurance, because they had told me at 15 that I would need to be self-sufficient if I wanted to go to college. What he also did not mention was that the mortgage was conditional on a co-signer, and that co-signer was me, because my father's credit had been damaged by a business venture he did not like to discuss, and my mother's income was seasonal, and the bank had said no to both of them. I did not know any of this when I signed the papers at the title company that afternoon. I thought I was just helping with the closing documents because my parents had a scheduling conflict and someone needed to be there to initial the pages. The woman at the closing table slid a stack of paper toward me and pointed to a line and said, "Sign here," and I signed. And she pointed to another line, and I signed, and she pointed to a third line, and I signed, and nobody told me I was promising to pay $312,000 if my parents ever stopped. I found out 6 months later when I opened a letter addressed to me at my dormitory address and read the words delinquent and default and co-borrower in a font that was designed to be unignorable. I called my mother, and her voice was tired, and she said, "Your father had a slow quarter at the firm. It's temporary. We just need you to cover the next 2 payments, and we'll pay you back." And I asked her why they had not told me what I signed. And she said, "You always understand. Quinn, you know how hard your father works. For this family, you know how much it means to him." I covered the 2 payments, and then I covered the next 4, and then I covered the next 12. And by the time I was 21 years old, I had paid $27,000 toward a mortgage that was not mine. And I had told no one, because no one had asked, and because I was still operating on the theory that understanding meant silence. Visual: a dormitory bed covered in spreadsheets and a cheap calculator with a cracked screen. The thing about being the useful one is that nobody checks on you, because they assume you are fine. And I was not fine. I was working 30 hours a week at a bookstore and picking up shifts at a coffee shop on weekends and eating peanut butter sandwiches for dinner because I could not afford the meal plan and I was paying my parents' mortgage, and I was still showing up to every family dinner with a casserole. My brother, by contrast, was being flown to business conferences and given a car allowance and introduced at family gatherings as the one who was going places, and I would sit at the table and watch him accept compliments for things I had done behind the scenes because I had written his application, essays, and I proofread his resumes, and I helped him network with my father's old contacts because I was good at remembering names and face, and it was good at making. My parents knew about the essays because I told them, and they thanked me vaguely. And my father said, "Quinn's always been the practical one." And my mother said, "She's just so good at helping." And the word helping was the word that erased me. Because helping meant I was not the star, and I was not the one they bragged about. And helping meant I was the scap. The mechanism was a clause in the original mortgage documents that I had never read closely because I was 19 and exhausted and trying to get back to my shift, and the title company woman had handed me a pen and pointed to lines, and I had signed without reading. I found it 3 years into the payments when I was 22, and I had just sent another $6,000 to cover a tax bill. My parents had forgotten to pay on the property, and I was sitting in my tiny studio apartment with the heat turned off to save money, and I was staring at a scanned copy of the original loan agreement that I had requested from the bank because I wanted to understand why the monthly amount kept going up. The clause was on page 17 in subsection 4, and it said that in the event of any payment default by the primary borrower, the co-borrower had the right to assume full ownership of the property through a process called equitable subrogation, and I read it 3 times before I understood what it meant. I did not want the cabin. I had never wanted the cabin, but the clause meant something else. It meant that I had been paying for something I did not own, and the law was on my side if I ever stopped paying. The law would give me the thing I had been buying. And I realized that for 3,287 days, I had been the one keeping the family's second home afloat, and nobody had ever said thank you, and nobody had ever asked if I could afford it, and nobody had ever offered to put my name on the deed. Visual: a stack of bank statements rubber-banded together, and a pen with a chewed cap on. The escalation happened slowly, and then all at once. When I was 24, my mother called me and said they wanted to renovate the cabin kitchen, and they needed $20,000, and I said I did not have $20,000 because I was still paying off my own student loans, and she said, "You always understand, Quinn. You know we can't do this without you." And I sent her $15,000 and did not tell her that it came from the emergency fund I had been building for myself. When I was 26, my father asked me to manage the rental bookings for the cabin because he was too busy, and my mother was too tired, and they did not trust a management company to handle the money. and I spent 2 years responding to guest inquiries, enticed inquiries and coordinating cleaners, and fixing scheduling conflicts, and handling complaints about broken appliances, and I never took a cut of the rental income because it was family and family. Help it. When I was 28, my brother got engaged to a woman named Allison, whose parents owned a regional media company, and suddenly the cabin was not just a cabin anymore. It was a wedding venue, and the wedding was going to be held there in the mountains, with 80 guests, and a catering tent, and a string quartet, and a photographer flown in from New York. My mother called me and said, "We need you to coordinate the logistics for the wedding weekend. We can't handle it ourselves, with all the other planning." And I said yes, because I always said yes, and I spent 9 months organizing vendors and seating charts and transportation schedules, and I did it all from my office during my lunch breaks and on weekends, and I never told anyone how much time it cost me, because I had learned. My brother and Allison broke up 3 weeks before the wedding. It was not a dramatic fight. It was a quiet unraveling caused by Allison, discovering that my brother had been less than truthful about his job title and his income and his future prospects. And she walked away, and she took her parents with her and my mother, called me in tears, and said the deposits are non-refundable. We're going to lose everything. And I spent the next month negotiating with vendors and getting partial refunds. And then 6 months later, my brother met someone else, and the wedding was back on. And this time they wanted a ceremony at the cabin and a reception at a restaurant in town. And my mother called me and said, "Same as before, Quinn. You know what to do." And I did know what to do. And I did know. I did not say anything about the fact that I had not been invited to either wedding, and I would not be attending. Visual. A computer screen with a wedding website open in one tab and a mortgage statement in another. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon in March when I was 32 years old, and I was sitting in my office at the architecture firm where I had worked for 7 years. My mother's voice was bright and brittle, and she said, "Quinn, we need you to come to dinner on Saturday. We have an announcement." And I asked what kind of announcement, and she said, "Your father is retiring, and we're selling the cabin to help fund the retirement, and we need you to sign some paperwork to release your name from the loan." I was quiet for a long moment, and she said, "Quinn, are you there?" And I said, "Yes, I'm here." And she said, "You always understand these things. You've always been so good about the financial side of everything." And I said, "I understand," and I hung up the phone. And then I sat in my office for 45 minutes, looking at the spreadsheet I had built 9 years ago that tracked every payment I had ever made toward the cabin mortgage and every transfer I had sent to cover taxes and insurance and maintenance, and every dollar I had spent to keep that property from being taken away by the bank. The spreadsheet had 217 rows, and each row had a date and an amount and a description, and the total at the bottom was $142,800 exact. And on the opposite side of the spreadsheet there was a column that tracked every rental dollar I had managed, and every vendor contract I had negotiated, and every scheduling conflict I had resolved, and the total at the bottom of that column was not a number I could calculate, because it was 7 years of labor. And it was 1,000 phone calls, and it was the exhaustion I had carried home. And it was the exhaustion I carried home. And it was its own call. The Saturday dinner was held at my parents' house, and there were 22 people in the dining room, and I was one of them, but I was sitting at the end of the table near the kitchen door, where the waitstaff would enter, and my mother had not set a place card for me, so I had to ask her where to sit, and she pointed to the corner and said, "Just find a spot. Quinn, you know we're tight on space." My father stood up after the appetizers were cleared, and he made a toast to his career and his retirement, and the sale of the cabin, and the sale of the cabin, and the beautiful future ahead of them. And everyone applauded, and then he said, "And we want to thank our daughter Quinn for helping. We want to thank our work over the years. She's always been such a help." And the word help landed in my chest like a stone. Visual: a black leather folio resting against a white tablecloth. I opened the folio and I pulled out the spreadsheet, and I set it on the table in front of me. My mother leaned over and said, "What is that, Quinn?" And her voice was the kind of voice you use with a child who is being difficult in a public place. And I said, "This is a record of every payment I have made toward the cabin mortgage since I was 19 years old." And I set it down, and I slid it across the table toward her. My father laughed and said, "Quinn, we appreciate everything you've done, but we've always taken care of the big expenses." And I said, "You have not taken care of them." And I pulled out a second document, which was the original loan agreement, and I pointed to my signature on the co-borrower line, and I said, "I have been the only person making payments on this property for 13 years, and you have not made a single payment since the first year." My mother's face changed, and she said, "That's not true. We've always handled the mortgage." And I said, "You have handled nothing." And I pulled out the bank statements I had requested from the bank, and I set them on the table. And I said, "These are the payment records for the past 13 years, and every single payment came from an account with my name on it." My brother said, "Quinn, this isn't the time." And I said, "It is exactly the time." And I looked at my mother, and I said, "You always told me." I understood, and I did understand. I understood that I was paying for a house I would never own, and I understood that I was the one holding. I understood that I was the one. And then I pulled out the third document, which was the notice I had already filed with the county recorder's office 2 weeks earlier. It was a simple document. It was a line against the property for the full amount of the payments I had made plus interest, and it had been filed and recorded, and it meant that my parents could not sell the cabin without paying me back first. My father's face went white, and he said, "You can't do that." And I said, "I already have." And then the outside witness spoke. Her name was Marjorie Ellis, and she was the attorney representing the buyers who had been planning to purchase the cabin for $450,000. And she had been sitting at the table because my parents had invited her to dinner to celebrate the deal, and she had been friendly and polite all evening. And now she was looking at the line document with the measured composure of someone who had spent 30 years recontract. She said, "This document appears to be valid and properly recorded." And she looked at my parents, and she said, "I cannot close on this property with an outstanding lien of this size." And my mother made a sound like a wounded animal, and my father started talking about how this was a misunderstanding, and how I had always been so helpful, and how they had always been to pay me back. And I sat there and I listened, and I did not raise my voice, and I did not cry, and I did not explain myself any further, because the receipts were on the table, and the attorneys were looking at them, and the words were not mine to defend any more. They were written in black ink on white paper, and they said everything I had never said out loud. Visual: a woman walking away from a house with a folio tucked under her arm. I stood up, and I walked out of the dining room, and I walked to the kitchen, and past the staff, and out the front door, and I did not look back. The punishment was not an attack. It was the removal of my invisible labor. I had been managing the rental bookings for the cabin for 7 years, and the login credentials were in my name, and the calendar was synced to my email, and the cleaning crew was scheduled through my account, and the tax records were filed with my contact information, and the insurance policy was auto-renewing on my credit card, and I had already canceled all of it before I walked into that dinner. I had sent an email to the cleaning crew and I had closed the rental account, and I had removed my credit card from the insurance portal, and I had forwarded the tax filing deadline to my mother's email, and I had not said a word about any of it. The cabin would go unbooked for the summer, and the insurance would lapse, and the property taxes would be late, and the sale would fall through because of the lien, and my parents would be left with a property they could not sell, and a mortgage they could not pay, and a retirement plan that had been built entirely on money I had earned and recognition I had never received. I did not do any of this to punish them. I did it to stop giving away parts of myself that I would never get back. The fallout was predictable in the way that a cold is predictable after you have been standing in the rain. My brother called me 6 days after the dinner, and his voice was tight and controlled, and he said, "Mom is devastated, and Dad is not sleeping, and you need to fix this." And I said, "Fix what?" And he said, "The line, the rental, the insurance, everything." And I said, "I have been fixing everything for 13 years. And he was quiet, and then he said, "You could have just talked to us." And I said, "I have been talking to you for 13 years, and you have not been listening." My father called me 2 weeks later, and he was angry, and he was trying to be businesslike. And he said, "We can work this out. We can come to an agreement." And I said, "There is no agreement to come to. I'm owed $142,800, and the lien will stay in place until I am how family works." And I said, "I know how family works, and I have been the one doing the work. While everyone will shriek." My mother called me a month later, and her voice was small in a way I had never heard before, and she said, "I never meant for it to be this way." And she said, "I always thought you understood." And I said, "I always thought you understood." And I said, "I always thought you understood," so much that I stopped being a person and started being a service. And then she said something I had not expected. She said, "Your brother asked me once why you were always the one doing things, and I said it was because you were easier." And she paused, and she said, "I did not mean it the way it sounds." And I said, "How did you mean it?" And there was a silence that lasted long enough for me to count my own heartbeat. And she said it meant that you never complained. And I said, "I never complained, because you made it clear that complaining was not allowed for me." She did not apologize, and I did not ask her to. That was the moment when I understood that the silence I had been carrying was not something they had given me. It was something I had accepted, and I had accepted it because accepting it was easier than admitting that the people who were supposed to love me did not know how to see me. Visual. A small apartment kitchen with a pot of tea and a phone face down on the counter. The silent phone is the part of the story that no one tells you about. After the calls stopped coming, there was a period of weeks where I kept looking at my phone and waiting for the next explosion and the next demand and the next request for understanding. And then, one day, I realized I had gone 12 hours without checking my notifications, and I felt nothing but relief. I moved into a smaller apartment with a window that faced a courtyard, and I bought a table for the kitchen, and I put a plant on it. And I watered the plant every Tuesday, and I did not ask anyone for permission to be there. My brother sent me a text message 2 months later that said, "Mom is going to therapy," and I did not respond for 3 days. And when I did, I said, "I hope it helps her," and he did not reply, and I did not expect him to. My father sent me a letter through certified mail that contained a check for $8,000 and a note that said, "This is a start," and I cashed the check, and I did not write back because the money was not an apology, and the note was not an accountability, and I had spent enough of my life accepting gestures that were meant to paper over the cracks. And then one evening in October, I was sitting at my new table with my tea and my plant and my phone on the counter, and the phone was silent, and I was 32 years old, and I had no idea what I was going to do with the rest of my life. And that was the most beautiful thing I had ever felt. I did not need them to apologize, and I did not need them to understand, and I did not need them to see me, because I had started to see myself for the first time, and what I saw was not a help, and not a service, and not a scaffolding. What I saw was someone who had been carrying a weight for 13 years, and had finally set it down. My name is Quinn, and at 32 years old, I learned that being useful to people who cannot see you is not the same as being loved by them, and I learned that understanding does not have to mean silence, and I learned that the quietest room in the world is the one where you are finally alone with your own name.